On July 15th, 2024, J.D. Vance was announced as Donald Trump's new running mate. In the 2022 midterm election, Vance won a seat on Ohio's state senate, his first elected position, and was sworn into office on January 3rd following the election. Now, I personally had no clue who J.D. Vance was when he was chosen as Trump's VP pick. Everything that I've found out about him since has been against my will. Like me, many Americans who are not involved in Ohio's state politics, why would you be, were also unsure of who this new, young, strapping politician was. And as it turns out, J.D. Vance is actually a best-selling author. In June of 2016, he published his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis. In that same year, the book sold roughly 414,000 copies, and after Vance was picked as Trump's running mate, those numbers only skyrocketed. The book had sold just under 10,000 copies this year, but following the Republican National Convention, a representative of HarperCollins, which publishes Hillbilly Elegy under its Harper imprint, estimates that it had sold more than 650,000 copies in all formats. I personally was flabbergasted when I found out that Donald Trump's new running mate was the one who wrote this book. Up until that point, I'd never read the book, but I had gotten the Netflix adaptation recommended to me in my home feed, and I admit, I was intrigued by the premise. I never ended up watching the movie. I already have 100 plus movies on my watch list, and more important matters to contend with. Namely watching 17 seasons of South Park in 6 months. I would rarely associate any politician with a hillbilly, redneck, white trash, working class even, simply due to the nature of their jobs. But Vance, at one point of his life at least, identified with some of these terms. After finding out about Vance's hillbilly alter ego, which is separate from his drag persona, the question was shifting to why Donald Trump would choose Vance to be his new running mate. I personally think it was because they had to change only 2 letters and none of the formatting on the yard signs, but I digress. To me and many others, it seemed that Vance was picked to appeal to white, evangelical, non-college educated, working class voters specifically, who through multiple statistics we've seen have cast more votes for Trump than their college educated and or non-evangelical white counterparts. Trump, of course, despite being for the working class, has never worked a day in his life, and is one of the most privileged men in America, especially when you consider how he's managed to completely avoid jail time for his many alleged crimes. The vice president, while not having a lot of power, is sometimes chosen to make up for a presidential candidate's shortcomings, like how Kamala Harris has been speculated to have chosen Tim Walz, a progressive white man, to make up for some of her not only intrinsic qualities, but also for some of her less than progressive political stances. America, the most developed country in the world, could not handle more than one person in office with a marginalized background. Trump picking Vance as his new running mate became even more confusing, however, when you looked at Vance's past comments about Donald Trump during the 2016 election. Vance, who had previously described himself as a moderate Republican, was described by PBS as saying in 2016 that he goes back and forth between thinking Trump is a cynical a-hole like Nixon who wouldn't be that bad and might even prove useful, or that he's America's Hitler. Vance began to publicly change course when he launched his Senate campaign in 2021. He deleted tweets in 2016 that included calling Trump reprehensible and an idiot. Was he wrong though? He apologized about his Trump criticism in a July 2021 Fox News interview and asked people not to judge him based on what he had said. I've been very open that I did say those critical things, and I regret them, and I regret being wrong about the guy, Vance said. I think he was a good president, and I think he made a lot of good decisions for people, and I think he took a lot of flack. Trump even endorsed J.D. Vance during his 2022 election campaign for the Ohio Senate. Now the two are deeply intertwined not only with each other, but also allegedly with a radical conservative initiative for the next Republican administration, aptly named Project 2025. Project 2025 was mostly developed by the Heritage Foundation, an institution whose mission is to build and promote conservative public policies based in Washington, D.C., although over 100 conservative groups are on the project's advisory boards. And yes, radical is a well-deserved title here. Let me just pick out a few of the proposed policies from the 922-page document. Can you tell? Yes, I will be paraphrasing, but feel free to read the entire document if you so wish. I'll even link it down below for you. Parts of Project 2025 call for the reversal of the FDA's approval of the abortion drug, mifepristone, and the enforcement of the Comstock Act, which prohibits drugs, medicines, or instruments used for abortions to be sent in the mail. Another part of the project is the recommendation that the Health and Human Services chief proudly state that men and women are biological realities, and that married men and women are the ideal, natural family structure, because all children have a right to be raised by the men and women who conceive them. The project also includes proposals of dismantling the EPA, outlawing pornography, banning the morning after pill, rolling back LGBTQ protections across the country, and the repeal of hazard order regulations which prevent minors from working in dangerous conditions. Those are literally just a few of the proposed policies, so I'll link a couple videos down below that go more in depth into the document. Why am I bringing this up at all? What the fuck does this have to do with hillbillies? We're getting to the bulk of the video, don't worry. I bring this up because there has been a lot of people claiming that both Trump and Vance are both deeply involved in Project 2025. If JD Vance were to be closely tied to this project, it would be a slap in the face to all of the working class people that he claims to be for. Not only that, but it would be further proof, in my alleged opinion, of his hypocrisy as a person and his use of poor white people as props for his political campaign. Trump has repeatedly denied involvement in Project 2025, saying on Truth Social in July,
"I know nothing about Project 2025. I have no idea who's behind it. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. Anything they do, I wish them luck. But I have nothing to do with them."
In his September debate with Kamala Harris, he said,
"I have nothing to do with Project 2025. I haven't read it. I don't want to read it. Purposefully. I'm not going to read it."
Despite Trump and his campaign's pushback, people have noted that some of Trump's former advisors from his first term in office are listed as authors on the project. On top of this, the project's former director, Paul Dans, said in an interview with CNN in September that he's visited the Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate several times and has spoken with Trump's campaign staff there. JD Vance also wrote the foreword to a forthcoming book by the plan's lead author, Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts. In response to these claims, the project's Twitter account posted a statement saying, "As we've been saying for more than 2 years now, Project 2025 does not speak for any candidate or campaign. We're a coalition of more than 110 conservative groups advocating policy and personal recommendations for the next conservative president. But it is ultimately up to that president, who we believe will be Donald Trump, to decide which recommendations to implement." I will give the Trump campaign a little bit of grace because despite everything, I still managed to somehow have empathy for everyone. These could just be weird coincidences, and there is a very real possibility that Trump and or Vance are not connected to the project's plans at all. But even if they're not, some of their policy proposals and rhetoric are still eerily similar to the project itself. JD Vance, once a struggling kid in a small town, now has an estimated net worth of almost $10 million and the backing of some of the most powerful elites in the country. In Hillbilly Elegy, he claims he was able to escape poverty due to the American dream and just a simple knack for hard work, unlike all that other white trash. While JD Vance is busy tirade over childless cat ladies, poor white rural neighborhoods are still struggling. Although in the book he attempted to answer the question of why a lot of them voted for Trump, and more importantly, why their culture is in a crisis, all he really did was blame the poor for being poor, giving white, rich liberals another reason to stick their noses up at those of us living in the buttfuck hills. While every politician is known for parading around their disadvantaged background, which can apparently mean anything nowadays, Vance's use of his traumatic upbringing is especially sinister, creating a culture war between those isolated, underserved whites and those of us who are from marginalized groups. Or in both those categories, right? And that becomes a culture war within the soul. Why be mad at JD Vance for abandoning his background and becoming one of the elites that he criticized in his books, when you can instead direct your vitriol and anger at immigrants and gay people? It's easy to take advantage of these often small-minded people. They already have been taken advantage of for years for their cheap labor and resources. Beyond white anger and ignorance is a far more complicated history of class identity that dates back to America's colonial period and British notions of poverty. In many ways, our class system has hinged on the evolving political rationales used to dismiss or demonize or occasionally reclaim those white, rural outcasts seemingly incapable of becoming part of mainstream society. Today, I know that's the longest intro I've ever written, we'll be taking a look at JD's life and what led him to where he is now. More than that, I'll be criticizing the main messaging of his memoir and giving my personal, alleged opinion, reasoning as to why I think JD Vance is a poser and a hypocrite. As a disclaimer, everything that I'm saying about JD Vance, and in turn his book Hillbilly Elegy, is for educational, entertainment, and critique purposes. Anything that I discuss about Vance's actions or his life as told in his memoir Hillbilly Elegy is alleged and my personal opinion. There is a lot of shit to cover, so please feel free to leave any of your feelings or takes down below, especially if you think I missed something crucial. I try, but alas, I am just one person. I'm actually thankful that I have my partner to support me during these times when I'm working on long scripts like these. She's right out there, actually. Babe? Oh yeah, sure. I'll take your covers off and throw them in the washing machine tonight, no problem. Yeah. We had a night alone to ourselves yesterday, if you're catching my drift, right? What? Sure! I'll vacuum in between your cushions too, no worries, babe. I love you. What a fucking nagging bitch.
I believe we hillbillies are the toughest goddamn people on this earth, he writes in his new memoir. But we hillbillies must wake the hell up.
Can't you just make your argument about immigration without making those claims?
Kristen, I hear you saying that they're baseless, but I'm not repeating them because I invented them out of thin air. I'm repeating them because my constituents are saying these things are happening. I mean,
But there's
just
no
yesterday.
evidence.
Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future.
Are you a racist?
Before we can really dive into Hillbilly Elegy, we have to describe what a hillbilly is exactly. Now, there are a ton of different meanings that you could use to describe this term, both positive and negative, but it's most commonly defined with a meaning that has a heavy negative, even derogatory connotation. Most of the definitions are based on common hillbilly stereotypes. In White Trash, the 400-year untold history of class in America, the author Nancy Eisenberg draws some important distinctions between hillbilly and a few other terms commonly associated with the poor white class. Redneck and white trash were often used interchangeably, though not everyone agreed that they were synonymous. Jonathan Daniels divided the poor into two camps: the worthy, hardworking poor who strove to move up the social ladder, and the vulgar and hopeless who were trapped on its lowest rung. As for the distinction between redneck and hillbillies, Eisenberg offers up this. Though redneck and hillbilly were both defined by the American Dialect Society in 1904 as uncouth countrymen, the following regional distinction was offered. Hillbillies came from the hills, and the rednecks from the swamps. Like rednecks, hillbillies were seen as cruel and violent, but with most of their anger directed at their neighbors, family members, and foreigners, unwelcome strangers. Hillbillies, aptly named, come from the hills of the Appalachian Mountains, which span 13 states from Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, all the way up to the lower part of upstate New York. Tracy Moore writes for Vanity Fair, "For a place so universally stereotyped, Appalachia actually defies stereotype. It is vast. It is 423 counties spread up and down 13 states. It's over 26 million people, and it runs from the bottom of New York to the top of the Mississippi. Whatever you think it is, drive an hour in any direction, and it isn't." My idea of Appalachia, being from northern PA, is vastly different from someone who's from Kentucky or West Virginia. Although some similarities might present themselves, put the hillbillies that I know from around here in the same room with some hillbillies from Kentucky, and the two would quite obviously be different from one another. Hillbillies are isolated and often considered backwards, ignorant, rude, or violent, compared to their civilized counterparts, aka the urban upper class. However, these descriptors can fit onto any country folk who are described with any sort of pejorative term, be it redneck or white trash. Eisenberg goes on to say that little separated northern mudsills from southern trash. Neither class gained much when reduced to cannon fodder. As late as the 1770s, a traveler passing through North Carolina found the residents to be the most ignorant wretches he had ever met. They could not even tell him the name of the place where they lived, nor offer directions to the next family's home. Insular country people greeted travelers with incredulous stares and looked upon them as strange, outlandish folks. These rural poor were people untethered from reality. Everywhere, they are just alike, possess pretty much the same characteristics, the same vernacular, the same boorishness, and the same habits. Everywhere, poor white trash. In Nancy Eisenberg's book, she explores where all of these derogatory terms used to describe poor white people came from, dating all the way back to the British colonies. Even now, hillbilly and redneck, while a person could self-identify with one of them, or both, they're often used as an insult to describe someone as stupid or backwards. Furthermore, white trash and trailer trash, for obvious reasons, are not often used as self-identifiers. These two terms are usually used by another person to insult someone who's poor and white, and describe them as lazy, dirty, and even worthless. Waste men and waste women, and especially waste children, the adolescent boys who comprised a majority of indentured servants, were an expendable class of laborers who made colonization possible. The so-called wasteland of colonial America might have had the makings of a new Canaan. Instead, waste people wasted away, fertilizing the soil with their labor while finding it impossible to harvest any social mobility. J.D. Vance, throughout his book, often reinforces these stereotypes and stigmas. This has caused a large pocket of Appalachians online to push back against Vance's negative tropes and messaging, boldly stating that J.D. Vance, quote, doesn't speak for us. Anthony Harkins, who co-edited Appalachian Reckoning, a region response to Hillbilly Elegy, and a professor of history at Western Kentucky University, said that it's totally legitimate for anyone to tell their own story and how they see it, but to present it as the story of Appalachia, to speak of a memoir of a culture, is problematic, particularly because that region has so often been stereotyped and misrepresented through recent history. In fact, an entire 151-page rebuttal was published by Elizabeth Kate after Hillbilly Elegy's success. Unfortunately, I could not get a copy of this from my local library, although I was able to extract this quote from the preview available to me on Google Books, so there's that. Many Appalachians are poor, but their poverty has a deep and coherent history rooted in economic exploitation. The coal industry is no longer a significant employment sector in Appalachia, but the dominance of coal's extractive logic has permanently ruined people and land in ways which we must still contend. The people of Appalachia are predominantly white, but the region is adding African American and Hispanic individuals at a rate faster than most of the nation. The average Appalachian is not, then, a white, hypermasculine coal miner facing the inevitable loss of economic strength and social status. But the average Appalachian's worldview may be impacted by individuals with cultural capital who are constantly assuming we are all made in that image. Vance, throughout the book, leaves out any sort of people who don't fit an exact hillbilly stereotype. Well, except for himself, which I'll be getting into later. What about people like me who grew up in these isolated areas and who love hunting and other hick activities, but who aren't deeply conservative? What about the non-white Appalachians? What about the queer Appalachians? What about country people like me who hate diesel trucks, but enjoy the taste of beer every now and then? Or the ones who don't pour lighter fluid all over their husband and then light him on fire when he comes home late? As Kate says in her rebuttal, the intentional omission of these voices fits a long tradition of casting Appalachia as a monolithic other America. The hillbilly twist is a particularly clever political move because it allows poor white folks living in swing states, like those listed above, to draw a quick line of demarcation around themselves. Hardworking but poor Americans, and the supposed immoral, lazy welfare queens and absent, violent hillbilly fathers spreading into their cities and towns. While most of this video is centered around specifically poor white people, it would be a disservice if I ignored the fact that there are country folk who aren't white. Every person of color doesn't live in urban areas. Vance, however, completely ignores the race politics that are presented in these isolated country areas. For example, at one point in Hillbilly Elegy, Vance is pulled over by a police officer while speeding home to say goodbye to his mama in the hospital. After explaining the rush he was in, Vance is completely let off the hook by the officer. Were JD not white, I'm not sure that this interaction would have gone so well. On top of this, while JD and other poor white people could always fall back onto their whiteness, poor people of color can't. History shows that the advantage of being white as opposed to being a person of color allowed his family to persist without having to bear the just consequences of their malfactions. His relatives were able to use their power to either physically or verbally threaten people into submission, and this ability seems to be an aspect of his heritage of which he both seeks to overcome and is the most proud. Despite this, many people throughout history have noted that those who are classified as white trash are not that different from some black and urban poor communities. Eisenberg writes, white trash Southerners were classified as a race that passed on horrific traits, eliminated any possibility of improvement or social mobility. They marked an evolutionary decline, and they foretold a dire future for the Old South. If whiteness was not an automatic badge of superiority, a guarantee of the homogeneous population of independent, educable freemen, then the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were unattainable. She goes on to say that in 1938, he, Howard Odum, sent questionnaires to distinguished academics across the country, asking each to define what poor white meant to him. The responses revealed how slippery the label poor white could be. The most popular adjective was shiftless. It was connected to a string of synonyms: purposeless, hand-to-mouth, lazy, unambitious, no account, no desire to improve themselves, inertia. All these descriptions conflated the unwillingness to work with some innate character flaw. Social proximity to blacks was the second most popular explanation for their association with shiftlessness. Ira D.A. Reid, a black scholar at Atlanta University, recalled that when he was growing up, race etiquette required that he never address a poor white with that name unless he expected to be called a redacted in return. For Reid, white trash, poor whites, and redacted all conveyed the same social stigma. To some middle-class whites, the slight elevation in status of poor whites over poor blacks was but an empty courtesy. In fact, JD includes a quote towards the beginning of Hillbilly Elegy from a book by Jeffrey Ryan, Appalachian Odyssey, to draw to his grandparents' exodus from Kentucky to Ohio. It was not simply that the Appalachian migrants, as rural strangers out of place in the city, were upsetting the Midwestern urban whites. Rather, these migrants disrupted a broad set of assumptions by northern whites about how white people appeared, spoke, and behaved. The disturbing aspect of hillbillies was their racialness. Ostensibly, they were of the same racial order, whites, as those who dominated economic, political, and social power in local and national arenas. But hillbillies shared many regional characteristics with the southern black arriving in Detroit. Throughout Hillbilly Elegy, Vance consistently affirms these stereotypes and negative impressions of poor whites. A good example of this is when Vance is describing the men he worked with at a tile warehouse during his college years. The problems that I saw at the tile warehouse I worked at run far deeper than macroeconomic trends and policy. Too many young men immune to hard work, good jobs impossible to fill for any length of time. There is a lack of agency here, a feeling that you have little control over your life, and a willingness to blame everyone but yourself. Vance, however, never questions why these people don't want to work. or better yet, questions generational and systemic poverty. Few were concerned about, much less offered any solution to their terrible poverty. Regarded as specimens more than cognitive beings, white trash sandhillers and clay eaters loomed as abnormalities, deformities, a notorious race that would persist generation after generation, unaffected by the inroads being made by social reformers. I just spent 9 pages getting ahead of myself. Oopsie. I've barely even talked about myself or why I feel such a strong urge to call out JD Vance in this book. Of course, everyone has free reign for what they want to talk about on the internet. There are, unfortunately, no rules. That's what makes the internet so great. However, don't be surprised if a white person gets shit on for making a video exclusively centered on issues within the black community. Hey, why'd you do that? Now, I'm not trying to use that as a direct example for what I'm talking about now, but rather what I'm trying to say is that it can be a little off-putting if someone who isn't from a certain community speaks on issues within said community as if they are the authority on the matter. God, if you will. I'm not. I swear, I'm not. Some people do have the skill to talk about issues that don't explicitly involve them in a respectful way. However, you're still going to end up upsetting at least a few people from that community, regardless of what you've had to say or how respectfully you went about it. What I'm getting at is that this issue is very close to my heart, and that's why I feel the urge to explosively shit on JD Vance. As I've already covered, terms like hillbilly, redneck, and white trash or trailer trash are often used in a derogatory manner to imply that someone is backwards, stupid, and, well, trashy, whatever that means. One could argue that identity has always been a part of politics, that aspiring people adopt identities the same way that they change their style of dress. Yet this is only a part of the story. Some people can choose an identity, but many more have an identity chosen for them. White trash folks never took on that name for themselves, nor did the rural poor describe their plight in recognition of having been cast out of society as waste people, rubbish, or clay eaters. Eisenberg goes on to say that eventually self-identified white trash who would come up in the world began defending their depressed class backgrounds as a distinct and perversely noble heritage. Before the end of the 1980s, white trash was rebranded as an ethnic identity, with its own readily identifiable cultural forms, food, speech patterns, taste, and for some, nostalgic memories. And become an identity it did. When discussing trailer parks, which have become the defining symbol of one's trashy status, she says, representing on the one hand a symbol of untethered freedom, the mobile home simultaneously acquired its reputation as a tin can, a small, cheap, confined way of life. Almost as soon as they were turned into permanent housing, many were associated with slums built on town dumps. As one commenter pointed out in a video that I made making fun of transphobic conservatives, I don't live in a trailer, and I never have. My home is quite nice, much nicer than some of those who live around me in worn down trailers. I recognize the privilege that I have at 21 to still live at home, and in a nice house at that. However, more than a few times in my life, this house was almost foreclosed on. Believe it or not, you can't tell someone's entire life story based off one room in their house during a 7-second video. In that video, I had given the conservative in question an unidentifiable Southern accent. Why? To point out his ignorance, of course. Yes, I fed into the stereotype. I've done this a lot in some of my skits and sketches online. As one Redditor put it, compared to many other regions in the United States, the South has higher poverty rates, poorer education outcomes, poorer health outcomes, less accessibility to healthcare, less accessibility to public transportation, etc. Some may blame it on elected officials, and while that may have some influence, we also just don't have as many resources. Mass media mocking people for being ignorant and uneducated and poor when many of these people are systemically disadvantaged leaves a very bad taste in my mouth. I won't say that all the jokes about the South are bad because some are kind of true and funny, but the stereotypes become a problem when people automatically assume I'm dumb because of the way I talk and don't listen to what I have to say. Vance proposes to answer the question of why these working class, mostly poor whites voted for Trump, but he never gets to the root of the problem: systemic inequality. Against white people? Yes, it can still exist, just not on the basis of race. It's this little thing called classism. And where do I get off criticizing Vance when I've also fed into these stereotypes? Well, I'll say this. I think that it is generally okay to make fun of people from rural backgrounds who are bigoted because of their ignorance. I know more than enough people from around here who are like that, believe me. I've heard my peers say the N-word with the hard R, just colloquially during breaks between class in my high school. And while yes, some of them were the definition of the hillbilly stereotype, on the other hand, there were huge amounts of well-spoken rich kids who did the exact same thing, except they were classist on top of it. It is one thing to make fun of people from rural backgrounds for this ignorance. It's a completely other thing to assume that everyone who has a Southern accent or who is a hick is racist or ignorant purely because of where they are from. Are my impressions feeding into this? Maybe. Do I even have the right to do this seeing as I live in a nice house? Maybe not. It's easy to pick on the poor rural white man since he's the last one standing who can still be made fun of without getting yourself flogged by liberals. And I say that, yes, in a derogatory sense, but not in the conservative derogatory meaning of the word liberal. Let's be clear. Another Redditor put it this way: I'm from Appalachia and it's a beautiful area, but it is also the face of poverty and is probably the most impoverished group of people in the US. In some places it's comparable to being in a third world country. I'm actually from the area that serves pretty much as the face of the region. We've been mocked and misunderstood for centuries to in ways make it easier and more justifiable to treat us like second-rate citizens, and as a result have been a disenfranchised group. We in many ways march to the beat of our own drum, as for centuries we could only depend on ourselves due to the isolation of the area. The area and the people have been exploited from private citizens and the government for our resources, mainly coal, and as a result we are cautious with outsiders. While one could say that I'm perpetuating a negative stereotype by giving some of the ignorant conservative characters in my sketches an obvious accent that's often predicated on viewing those with accents like they are stupid, I have to disagree with this sentiment a little. I know that was a run-on sentence, but I think you are picking up on it, putting it down, correct? For one, I know people in real life who are exactly like the people I'm making fun of. Secondly, I don't view my stereotyping to be nearly as damaging compared to a rich liberal from the city putting on a cowboy hat and a terrible accent to paint rural people as backwards freaks. Although I am intelligent and quite educated, an aspect of myself that goes against every stereotype of what a hillbilly is, I still have experienced disenfranchisement in my life at different levels. I feel that if I were to go to Yale like Vance did, I would be the outsider, the country bumpkin, despite how classy I present myself in ways of speech or clothing choices. In White Trash, Eisenberg covers a bill called Bill for the More General Diffusion of Knowledge. Thomas Jefferson laid out a proposal for different levels of preparation. For the second tier, he called for 20 young geniuses to be drawn from the lower class of each county. Rewarding those with merit, he devised a means of social mobility in a state where education was purely a privilege to wealthy families. His handful of lucky scholars would be raked from the rubbish, leaving the majority to wallow in ignorance and poverty. The rubbish designation showed contempt for the poor, a sad reminder that very few were capable of escaping the refuse heap. But the bill failed to pass. The Virginia gentry had no desire to pay for it. They had no interest in raising up a few stray kernels of geniuses from the wasteland of the rural poor. Again, while we were never in extreme poverty, we've never been rich, or even upper middle class by any means. Most of my family is working class, and I, like most of them, did not go to college. Although I could probably handle it in terms of intelligence, I felt extremely discouraged when I was applying for colleges during my senior year. Not only did I not have a single flying fuck idea of what I was doing, but I knew that I would be in debt for the rest of my life unless I got really lucky. On top of this, our income wasn't low enough to qualify for higher assistance, despite the fact that my family would have never been able to cover even a decent percentage of my tuition. As a child, we faced the same issue when we tried to apply for food stamps after we had suffered major changes in our finances. On discussing Abraham Lincoln's country roots, Eisenberg writes, a different kind of symbolism hovered over Abraham Lincoln. Though he was born in Kentucky, not far from Jefferson Davis's birthplace, Honest Abe's backcountry roots became fodder for his enemies. The one thing that separated Lincoln and Davis was class origin. Southern newspapers described Davis as born to command. Lincoln, by contrast, was a rude bumpkin. Union General David Hunter told Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase that Lincoln was born a poor white in a slave state, anxious for approval, especially of those he was accustomed to look up to. His Kentucky home made him white trash, and his chosen residence in Illinois made him a prairie mudcell. J.D. Vance was able to advance in society due to a multitude of reasons. Reasons that a large amount of people from poor rural backgrounds don't have. Take for instance that Vance is from Middletown, Ohio, which in the township alone has had a population that has hovered steadily around 50,000 people since his childhood. Where I'm from, my entire county consists of that number. Both Warren and Butler County, Ohio, the two counties that Middletown splits in, had about 100,000 and 300,000 residents in the 90s when Vance was a child. This is not to say that people can't experience disenfranchisement in populated areas. I mean, look at some parts of New York City. But it's not the same kind of disenfranchisement that people in extremely isolated areas face. For instance, I have to drive at least an hour to get to a place of any importance. 3 if I want to get to an actual big city. Middletown is a 45-minute drive from Cincinnati. Of course, public transport is another issue that plagues rural communities, where it doesn't in cities. I mean, public transport is, of course, deplorable across the country, but it is especially deplorable in rural areas, okay? We have to rely on single-person vehicles around here, not to mention the poor infrastructure, with half of our roads looking like Godzilla and King Kong had bareback sex on them. The U.S. Department of Transportation's Federal Highway Administration estimates that 40% of roads in rural areas are inadequate for current travel, while nearly 50% of bridges over 20 feet long are currently considered structurally deficient. The Federal Highway Administration also reports that in 2012, 54% of all road fatalities occurred in rural areas. It takes on average 9 miles more when compared to cities in rural areas to reach medical or dental services. Me personally, it takes about 10 miles to reach the closest option to either of these. If you don't have a personal vehicle, it becomes virtually impossible to go anywhere unless you're a runner, a track star, or if you have someone to rely on for transport. Despite Middletown's closer distance to Cincinnati, there is a possibility that public transport is bad there, meaning that poor residents suffer from very similar issues to smaller rural areas like where I'm from do. If you are from the area, please comment your experience down below. Is the public transport there bad or not? And that's only the tip of the iceberg of what rural areas have to deal with. Another big one is lack of healthcare access. This can be due to workforce shortages, lack of health insurance, a poor health literacy, lack of access to broadband, and privacy issues. Let's take this bit by bit, with the list that I provided coming from Rural Health Info Hub. As of September 2022, 65.6% of primary care health professional shortage areas were located in rural areas. On top of this, from a 2022 statistic, non-metropolitan children and adults under 65 were more likely than their metropolitan peers to be uninsured. As we all know about the stigma of small towns, people really do know everything about everyone. I am lucky enough to be such a hermit that almost no one around here knows jack shit about me. But if you have a popular name, let it be known that we know what you're getting up to. This lack of privacy can lead people to feel fear in seeking more stigmatized treatments such as HIV testing. People may see you, or you even may personally know your healthcare provider. On top of this, due to the isolation, there may be stigmas associated with these kinds of treatments. Homophobia. Ever heard of it? The last two reasons for poor healthcare are both issues in their own right: lack of internet access and poor health literacy. Compared to their urban counterparts, rural individuals are nearly 2 times more likely to lack broadband access. This could lead to issues with accessing telehealth services, which we saw many providers switch to during the throes of Big Rona. I'll again use myself as an example. I'll be your sacrificial pig. During my senior year of high school, we would frequently have to stay home and use Zoom for the school day due to outbreaks at our school. I fucking hated this. Our internet at the time, and up until about 5 months ago, had a highest download speed of 2 megabytes per second! I would frequently lag during classes and faced a legit fear of being booted off the Zoom call if I had to open a tab for something other than the Zoom. My family would literally have to be barred from using the internet while I was in school. This changed a few months back when, thankfully, Elon Musk's Starlink expanded to our area. This is the one thing I will praise that man for. It still costs $120 a month though. For those who are poor, internet access even to services like these may still be hindered due to cost alone. Rural residents are also less likely to subscribe to broadband service. Rural areas have lower median incomes than urban areas. The majority of the nation's persistent poverty counties are rural, and many rural areas have older populations. So companies basically just don't see us as a worthy investment. On top of this, fast reception speeds may be lacking due to the fact that you, I don't know, live in the middle of fucking nowhere. Even if you have reliable service, you may not be able to afford unlimited data on your phone plan, or you may not have options to those cheaper plans. Hell, I had a friend a few years back, he left me on Delivered Eternally, who lived 2 miles from me. Legit 2 miles from me, not even. 2 miles. And Verizon stated that they had no internet options for where his home was located, leading to him relying on cellular hotspots alone. Something that coincides with lack of internet access is the general poor education options that are prevalent in rural communities. Health literacy can also be a barrier to accessing healthcare. This can be especially concerning in rural communities, where lower educational levels and higher incidence of poverty often impact residents. Low health literacy can make residents reluctant to seek healthcare due to fear or frustration related to communicating with a healthcare professional. Additionally, navigating the healthcare system can be difficult without health literacy skills. But the access to education is a problem that rural communities across the nation face. I'm lucky to have a school that is much better, not perfect, but much better than some of the schools that both poor urban and rural communities have. An interesting thing to point out is that in a study by Brookings, they noted that in some rural districts, poor and non-poor students are experiencing similar levels of educational opportunity, whereas in other rural districts, poor and non-poor students see pronounced test score differences. This differs from some urban communities where some of the schools are divided largely by class lines. In rural areas, there's one school in your area and that's pretty much it. You know, take it or fucking leave it. Other barriers to education are limited funding, teacher shortages, fewer course options, outdated infrastructure, limited transportation, limited college and career counseling, and the obvious one, lack of diversity and exposure to experiences for students. As an example, we had 3 language options when I was in school: French, Spanish, and Latin. Can you tell which one I took? Figure it out. This dwindled down to 2 when our only French teacher retired. On the other hand, my school happened to receive a grant to give every kid in our high school their own iPad. While yes, there were about 600 kids in our high school in total at the time of when I was in there, this is still a privilege that isn't afforded to a lot of poor schools across the nation. I hope that from covering all of this, you can see that every issue is intertwined to make people born into rural communities already at a disadvantage than their urban, or to better put it, richer counterparts. I didn't have healthcare for a few years when I was a teenager, and it was actually very frightening. I am still, to this day, worried about losing my coverage. With all of this being said, the issues that Vance presents in Hillbilly Elegy are deeply personal to me, and I'm sure to many others from around here. We have a lower median household income than the nation as a whole, and like most rural areas, a higher poverty rate. Despite aspects of my family falling into certain stereotypes, they don't want to be associated with white trash, the worthless rubbish of our area. While I don't think that we would be the first picking to be called terms like this as insults, I still feel connected to the identity simply due to where I live and some of the activities I partake in. As I previously stated, were I to go and live in a richer area, I would face certain stigmas and stereotyping. Like JD, I have no fucking idea why rich people use multiple utensils for dinner. Get a fork, a spoon, and a finger and you're set, baby. Like, what the fuck? Too many steps to make something simple less simple. Why are we doing this? The country boy, Lyndon Johnson, might have been enjoying his moment in the sun just then, but he knew in his heart that his place among the power elite was not really secured. He was not fully accepted. A country boy might at any moment reveal some sign of a white trash character. And now I hope I'm not coming across like I get off on self-victimization. I do sometimes, but not right now. I'm just trying to paint a comparison between me and JD Vance. In a lot of ways, I don't fit the hillbilly stereotype. By no means am I uneducated or stupid, but some could say that I am uncultured because I haven't had the money to travel. Vance, however, describes multiple different road trips that he went on with his family. At one point he says, "During one family trip, we went to the Castro district of San Francisco, so that in the words of my older cousin Rachel, I could learn that gay people weren't out to molest me." How sweet. The farthest place I've been from home is Washington, D.C., and that school trip was cut short due to a winter storm. I will never forgive the fucking weather for doing that to me. This quote from JD just proves his hypocrisy, in my opinion. At one point following this, he describes himself as a teen, questioning whether or not he was actually gay. To his questioning, his mama replies, "Even if you did want to suck dicks, that would be okay. God would still love you." The most normal reply, right? JD reflects on this, saying, "Now that I'm older, I recognize the profundity of her sentiment. Gay people, though unfamiliar, threaten nothing about Mama's being. There were more important things for a Christian to worry about." Clearly they aren't, because as Advocate reported, Vance said that before he took office, he would have voted against the Respect for Marriage Act, which wrote marriage equality into federal law to protect it against future negative Supreme Court decisions. The religious liberty of this piece is very bad, he told the anti-LGBTQ group Mission America in July 2022. In 2022, he tweeted, "I'll stop calling people groomers when they stop freaking out about bills that prevent the sexualization of my children." He also criticized his Democratic opponent, Tim Ryan, for voting for the Equality Act, a national ban on anti-LGBTQ+ discrimination, as a member of the US House. Why this seemingly sudden switch up then? Interestingly enough, Vance had a transgender friend during his time in Yale, a friendship that lasted until 2021, when Vance said publicly that he supported an Arkansas bill that would ban gender-affirming care for minors. Sophia Nelson was interviewed during an episode of the New York Times show The Daily, giving their thoughts on JD's, as they see it, shift in politics. In Hillbilly Elegy, Vance refers to Sophia as a lesbian, a term which they do not identify with. An email was then sent from Vance to Sophia saying the following: "Hey Sophs, here's an excerpt from my book." Mr. Vance wrote to his friend Sophia Nelson, "I send this to you not to brag, but because I'm sure that if you read it, you'll notice a reference to an extremely progressive lesbian. I recognize now that this may not accurately reflect how you think of yourself, and for that I'm really sorry. I hope you're not offended, but if you are, I'm sorry. Love you, JD." Nelson wrote back on the same day calling Mr. Vance buddy and thanking him for being sweet. Now you can definitely criticize this person for sharing private emails between them and JD, but now that they've been released to the public, I feel that it was important to cover this. In the emails, Vance seemed willing to discuss and even come to an agreement on certain social and political issues. In my opinion, this varies a lot from the JD Vance that we see now, a hardline Trump Republican. I can't help but feel saddened by the matter of their friendship, not only because of what it once was, but also because it was revealed to the public in this way. This is something that I think a lot of people have experienced with their friends and family. People who diverted away from the rational and instead became senseless worshippers of Donald Trump and conspiracy theories. Lyndon Johnson once said, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice that you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you." This is why I personally find JD Vance's shift in politics to be so insidious. Many other people from Appalachia have felt used and abused by Vance's elegy, pointing to the same issues that I've vaguely covered of Vance being an alleged hypocrite and possibly even, allegedly, embellishing his life to make it seem like he struggled more than he actually did. Allegedly, right? I can't say that enough. In order to justify his memoir as something more than the tale of a drug-addicted mother and a son who went to Yale, he fashions a grand theory that being a hillbilly does not have to be related to social class, or even living in Appalachia. To Vance, hillbillyness becomes a kind of cultural trait, tied to a family history and identity, not class. His grandmother, he writes, had thought she had escaped the poverty of the hills, but the poverty, emotional if not financial, had followed her. Indeed, as I alluded to earlier, Vance's small town is anything but. Instead, it's a small suburban area that faces issues. These issues are similar, but not the same, to the issues that small towns face. A higher population and closer access to services that are only provided in big cities makes the problems that a troubled suburban area faces much more different than a town filled with, say, 1,000 people. When I listen to old interviews of Vance describing himself as a hillbilly, I can't help but feel confused. He certainly is one now, mostly due to the fact that he's highly educated and lives in a house that it cost well over $1 million at the time of purchase. But people have questioned whether he was really a hillbilly in the first place. Vance recalls presenting himself to other classmates at Yale as a conservative hillbilly from Appalachia. Vance paid himself as a hillbilly because his maternal grandparents are from the sticks in Kentucky. They moved to Ohio before JD was born in hopes of making better money from the steel industry in Middletown. As Vance says, the engine that brought them from the hills of Kentucky into America's middle class. Vance's exposure to Appalachia was as a young vacationer visiting relatives. This famously has not stopped Vance from identifying as Appalachian, a hillbilly at heart, he writes, based on a perceived inheritance of dysfunctional family traits. He has this notion that being a hillbilly is kind of genetic. Leonard Davis, a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, says. Although I have pushed back on the stereotypes surrounding hillbillies throughout this video, as I stated before, we cannot deny that these stereotypes are a large part of what makes someone identify with this mostly derogatory term. Vance, who grew up in a suburb that's 45 minutes outside of Cincinnati and not close to Appalachia geographically, self-identifies with the term hillbilly for reasons that I do not understand. Vance, save for his proclivity for physical violence as a kid, doesn't display any of the characteristics that someone would associate with a hillbilly. And he certainly doesn't today. No, Vance has fully become part of the elite that he's so often criticized, allegedly abandoning his background once it no longer proved useful for him. Appalachia is simply a rhetorical device for Vance that he used to launch a political career. If your political goal is to blame the poor for their own problems, then using the regional ethnicity of your grandparents to present yourself as authentic can compel readers to believe your narrative or to feel good about having already believed it. After all, the narrative of the lazy hillbilly has existed for as long as rich folks outside of Appalachia needed an explanation for mountain poverty that doesn't include blaming themselves. Vance opens up his memoir saying, "It says right there on the cover that it's a memoir. But I'm 31 years old, and I'll be the first to admit that I've accomplished nothing great in life." Great start. He goes on to describe his background a little bit more, saying, "I didn't write this book because I've accomplished something extraordinary. I wrote this book because I achieved something quite ordinary, which doesn't happen to most kids who grew up like me. You see, I grew up poor, in the Rust Belt, an Ohio steel town that has been hemorrhaging jobs and hope for as long as I can remember. The statistics tell you that kids like me face a grim future, that if they're lucky, they'll manage to avoid welfare, and if they're unlucky, they'll die of a heroin overdose, as happened to dozens in my small hometown last year. I almost failed out of high school. I want people to know what it feels like to nearly give up on yourself. I want people to understand what happens in the lives of the poor and the psychological impact that spiritual and material poverty has on their children. For those of us lucky to live in the American dream, the demons of the life we left behind continue to chase us." Heavy on the spiritual part of that, in my opinion. As many Ohioans have stated online, Middletown is far from a wealthy suburb, and it would be unjust to describe it as that. While some would allege that JD didn't grow up as poor as he says he did, to claim that he was secretly rich is just an outright lie. More privileged than some people, sure, but he certainly didn't grow up with a silver spoon in his mouth. There are levels to people's struggles. All this being said, I, and many others, personally don't see how JD Vance grew up as poor, as he repeatedly described it throughout his memoir. "I grew up as a poor kid," Vance said on Fox News in August 2024. "I think that's a story that a lot of normal Americans can empathize with." Now, all of this is of course just my personal opinion, not fact, because I don't need to be getting sued. One Redditor chimed in saying, "The only thing I'd say is that Middletown is not really wealthy. It's commonly referred to as Middle Tucky locally. But it's also not the destitute shithole that Vance portrays either. He paints it like a third world country with a totally failed education system when it's a decently functional city with pretty good schools." In White Trash, Eisenberg says, "Past poverty was no encumbrance. Roots, whatever they were not a stain upon the present." In summing up Irving Howe's World of Our Fathers, 1976, an affectionate story of the ethnic life of Jews on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, one reviewer concluded, "Everybody wants a ghetto to look back on." This is especially true when we consider people who are not only in the public eye, but who also have power within their social and financial statuses. Politicians and celebrities alike are always trying to be seen as relatable by the general public, even to the point of embellishing their own life story. J-Lo, no, I'm not gonna throw the poor woman under the bus right now. This is about JD Vance, not her. In a Rolling Stone article, the author says that Vance frames the book as a chronicle of overcoming severe economic disadvantage. But the details of Vance's own writing don't point to a childhood of material deprivation. Instead, despite the myriad of troubles faced by his mother with substance abuse, Vance was raised in a middle-class comfort. At one point, his parents enjoyed a six-figure income. And he was spared economic distress by a broad safety net of extended family that provided him with frequent out-of-state vacations, golf lessons, a modeling audition, and therapy. Most importantly, he benefited from a buffer of generational wealth created by his pawpaw, who retired with a lucrative pension from his union job at the steel plant. As a disclaimer, that modeling audition, I don't like that the author of this just painted it like JD Vance was the one receiving the audition. Certainly not. That was for actually his sister. She had received a modeling audition in the book, and she denied it because she needed to stay at home with Vance and his mom, who was suffering from addiction. After the publication of this article, several statements were added to it from people who are close to Vance, disputing what claims the author is making. After publication, a spokesperson for Vance responded with a statement attributed to Vance's aunt, Lori Meebers. JD did grow up poor, and any suggestion otherwise is a lie and an insult to our family, she says. As evidence that life was tough for JD, Meebers refers to details of Vance's upbringing that do not appear in his memoir. That's interesting. For example, that money got so tight that they even had to dig... oh my god, I almost said dig. Jesus Christ. We had to sell our dog's livers on the black market, okay? She adds that when JD lived with Mama, his room didn't have heating or air conditioning, and she often relied on JD to buy her groceries. My mom lived on a fixed income and was poor for the last decade of her life, including when she shouldered the burden of caring for JD, his sister, and his mother as she struggled with addiction. My dad's pension was meant to help a couple make ends meet in retirement. It wasn't meant to support a whole family of 5. A spokesperson for Vance adds several other claims of difficult living that do not appear in Hillbilly Elegy, including that Vance's mother was enrolled in the Women, Infants, and Children program when she was pregnant with JD and into his early life. The spokesperson also asserts that Vance's mother briefly moved the family into an income-controlled apartment, that JD often attended school without enough money to pay for lunch, and that Mama eventually received nutrition support from Meals on Wheels. I don't know about all of you. Me personally, I would include that in my memoir. Right? Vance went through some shit. There is no doubt about that. It would be insulting to assume so. His mom became addicted to pharmaceutical drugs and then illegal drugs after stealing them from the hospital that she worked at as a nurse. He recounts her abusing him both physically and verbally, multiple times throughout the book. It's due to his mom's abusive behavior and her cycling through multiple boyfriends that Vance ended up living with his mama in her Ohio home during most of his childhood. Due to his time spent with his grandparents, mostly his grandmother, and the cultural transition of hillbilly values from places like Kentucky to southern Ohio, there is a reasonable explanation for why he identifies as an Appalachian hillbilly. While I can understand where he's coming from with his self-identification, and I'd also like to stop arguing about the semantics of his upbringing, I cannot excuse the amount of misinformation and negative stereotypes about Appalachians that are presented in his book. It's no surprise that Vance gets so many things wrong about the region, and poor rural rights as a whole, when his ties to these communities are often disputed in online threads. I know every time I say poor rural whites, I can barely get it out. That's just how I talk, okay? Poor rural whites. Rural. I can't say it like rural. That's how you say it. They gave us the name rural to make us sound stupid when we say rural, right? I sound stupid when I say that, do I not? That's like the fear of long words. The name that they gave it, evil. If you'd like to save yourself the brain cells, don't go on Reddit and read threads of people arguing about JD fucking Vance of all people. Maybe if JD had combated some of the negative stereotypes associated with Appalachian hillbillies, then people wouldn't feel the need to contest his life story so much. Vance is allowed, like anyone else, to share his experiences with the world. But to paint his memoir as an answer to the extreme poverty that the region has faced for centuries is irresponsible. A Vulture article mainly critiquing the Netflix adaptation of Elegy brought up some interesting arguments that can still apply to Vance's book. In Vance's Appalachia, poverty and immortality intertwine. Success happens to hardworking people, and structural explanations for poverty receive glancing attention when he chooses to mention them at all. Vance, meanwhile, is a hero by virtue of his escape. The deceased do not give elegies for themselves. Survivors do that. And so Vance can speak for the hillbilly because he no longer is one. Because he went to Yale, the stereotype of the uncouth, white, reprobate no longer applies. Throughout the book, Vance is clearly depicting his life story as a prime example of the American dream. While maybe at one point in time, especially for those who have certain privileges, this dream was a reality. But in today's America, it is anything but. Now, I do think that the anecdotal evidence in this case is evidence enough, but let's look at some statistical reports to back up what I'm saying. Researchers with the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty published a report in 2017, which is based on data from the University of Michigan's panel study of income dynamics. They found that only 16% of persistently poor children, those living more than half of their lives from birth to 17 years in poverty, become successful young adults. This is just one scientific report among many that prove that upward mobility is extremely difficult, if not impossible, for kids who are born into low-income households, let alone for kids who are born in a shack with no plumbing in the middle of fucking Kentucky. It's no wonder why kids who are born poor will most likely stay that way as adults, when you factor in the many classes, systemic factors that keep people down in this country. Crime and the justice system, taxation, and the fact that low-income people pay more in taxes than their wealthy counterparts. just to name a few. Children from poor families are much less likely to work in adulthood than children from middle-class families. Only about 60% of children from the poorest families are working at age 30, compared with 80% of children from median-income families. Instead of talking about any of this, and maybe, I don't know, not blaming poor people for being poor, Vance takes a different approach. Although towards the beginning of the book he says, of course, the reasons poor people aren't working as much as others are complicated, and it's too easy to blame the problem on laziness. His sentiment changes very quickly. Working as a cashier turned me into an amateur sociologist. I learned how people game the welfare system. They'd buy 24 packs of soda with food stamps and then sell them at a discount for cash. They'd ring up their orders separately, buying food with food stamps, no fucking shit, and beer, wine, and cigarettes with cash. They'd regularly go through the checkout line speaking on their cell phones? What? I could never understand why our lives felt like a struggle, while those living off of government largesse enjoyed trinkets that I only dreamed about. Here he's describing people using the cash that they receive from selling these packs of soda to feed their addictions, since you're not allowed to use food stamps to buy substances. Hence the word food in the title. I hope that helped a little bit. Not surprising, since low-income Americans are at a higher risk of facing addiction. Although there is no evidence that demonstrates cause and effect between poverty and addiction, studies have shown that substance abuse is more common among individuals of lower economic status. Vance's own mom became addicted to opiates by stealing them from the hospital that she worked at, opioids that were produced by the evil Sackler family and their company Purdue Pharma. Yet Vance, in one of his recent political ads, disturbingly uses his mom's addiction as a reason to spew racism at Mexicans coming in over the southern border, clearly insinuating that the drugs that are being brought into the US are what caused his mother's addiction in the first place. Interestingly enough, it was revealed in 2020 that Vance allegedly worked for a white shoe law firm that represented multiple Chinese companies and lobbied for Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin. Vance then hired an American Enterprise Institute resident who cited Purdue-funded studies to downplay the role overprescribing painkillers plays in the opioid crisis as the addiction specialist to Ohio's Appalachian region for his nonprofit Our Ohio Renewal. Vance then describes how these welfare recipients had the gall to have cell phones while he could barely afford Abercrombie and Fitch. How dare poor people have an item that could possibly give them better opportunities? You know you're supposed to come into the grocery store with tattered rags for clothes to prove to me that you deserve food stamps. Here JD is only reiterating the common trope that people on welfare are losers who use and abuse the system. This only worsens the lack of public sympathy and governmental help that poor people in this country receive. PBS reports that for every 10,000 households participating in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, about 14 contained a recipient who was investigated and determined to have committed fraud. via 2018 report by the Congressional Research Service. Within SNAP, for every 10,000 paid in benefits, about $11 is determined by state agencies to have been overpaid due to recipient fraud. Another quote from Elegy that shows Vance's victim-blaming mentality is when he says, "We spend our ways into the poorhouse. We buy giant TVs and iPads. Our children wear nice clothes thanks to high-interest credit cards and payday loans. We purchase homes we don't need, refinance them for more spending money, and declare bankruptcy, often leaving them full of garbage in our wake. We spend to pretend we're upper class. We know we shouldn't spend like this." Polly Taylor says, not in response to this direct quote, quotes like these are horrible oversimplifications of complex problems like income inequality and lead to stigmatization rather than any positive solution. This narrative circulates because we scrutinize the apparent life choices of the poor in ways in which we just don't for the rich. Why have they got the latest trainers and an iPhone? Across a series of 11 studies involving more than 4,000 participants, Serena Haggerty and Kate Berez from Harvard Business School found that we tend to believe lower income people need less than those on higher incomes. Sorry, my camera died, so if the angle looks a little different, that's why. Anyway, let's get back to poor people. If you include the fact that poor people are less likely to be educated and more likely to face family dysfunction, be it addiction and or abuse, is it any surprise that some poor people are bad with money? Instead of coming at any of the issues presented in his book with a bit of sympathy, Vance instead presents himself as the example of the one who got away, to quote Katy Perry. Because he got out, you should be able to do it too. There are definitely poor people who spend too much and make poor financial decisions, but there are rich people who do it too. Why is DJ Khaled's sneaker collection seen as aspirational? But Trailer Trash Becky's $250 60-inch Vizio TV that's gonna break down in 2 years, a poor financial decision. With all this being said, how was Vance so lucky then? That's just it. He was lucky. Pulitzer-winning author Barbara Kingsolver, author of Demon Copperhead, said she felt it was her duty to tell a different story of Appalachian life than the one that Vance presented in the book. It used the same old victim-blaming trope. It was like a hero story. I got out of here. I went to Yale. But those lazy people, you know, they just don't have ambitions. They don't have brains. That's why they stuck where they are. I disagree, and that's my job, to tell a different story. Not unlike the coal companies that came into the hills to use the poor for their cheap labor, Vance also, in my alleged opinion, exploits the poor of Appalachia. Now, we can acknowledge all of the issues that these areas face, but at the same time, racism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia, and all other kinds of isms are very serious issues in these areas. Take it from me. However, not everyone from rural communities such as the South or Appalachia are like this, and to stereotype all of us like this does us a disservice. Now, I would never expect a person of color to empathize with a racist, or for a queer person to see a homophobe's side, but there are reasons as to why these issues are so prevalent in these areas. Not only are they isolated, but they often lack good education. Politicians like Vance prey on them and use easy scapegoat culture wars, like the woke agenda, to divert away from their scummy behaviors that are allegedly being done in the dark. Wokeness is just a new term to put the responsibility of our country's disarray onto those who are marginalized, rather than on the true oppressors, the ruling class. The same people who are keeping the poor whites down in the dumps. Politicians see the hillbillies' fear of outsiders and use this to scapegoat migrants who actually aren't eating people's dogs and cats, a harmful stereotype that has been perpetuated by xenophobia for years, to place all of our country's problems on them. There's no doubt that putting a large amount of people into an area that cannot support said amount of people is an issue that needs to be solved, or that some of the people coming from across the border are bad people, but insinuating that all of them are cat-eating drug dealers is dangerous. The National Immigration Forum reported in 2023 that evidence indicates that illicit fentanyl is primarily brought into the US by American citizens, and usually through legal ports of entry. The calculation is simple. Illicit drug smuggling organizations are likely to prefer US citizens as smugglers because they are less likely to raise alarms or undergo additional vetting when re-entering the US through a legal port. In 2021, 80% of fentanyl trafficking convictions were for US citizens. The Cato Institute also notes how just 0.02% of people, 279 out of 1 million migrants encountered by the Border Patrol for crossing unlawfully possessed fentanyl. It's also interesting to note that the DEA reported that most of the chemicals used to produce fentanyl are coming from China and then into Mexico for production, with most of the fentanyl in the country coming from US citizens smuggling it from across the border, indicating a real and serious problem. I don't claim to have all the solutions, but I do know that putting Haitian migrants in danger by scapegoating them for the drug problem that our country's facing is blatantly wrong. In Springfield, Ohio, where the lie that Haitian migrants were eating people's pets was started, threats of bombings and shootings led to the closure of city buildings and schools for several days. The majority of the 12,000 to 15,000 migrants who have arrived in Springfield over the past 4 years are from Haiti, according to the city of Springfield. These Haitian migrants left their country due to gang-related violence and poverty, in search of stability, safety, and job opportunities. They came to the US under the Temporary Protected Status designation. They came here for the American dream. But I guess that only applies if you're someone like JD, a hillbilly who is better than the rest of them. Vance claims to be from Appalachia, but has the understanding of it that you'd expect to see from a rich liberal who was born and raised in Manhattan. In the long and often bloody history of Appalachia, there is precedent for what both Howard, the director of the Netflix adaptation of Hillbilly Elegy, and Vance have done. Capitalism extracts. It takes timbers from the forest, coal from the mountains, and labor from the people. The hillbilly is just another resource to exploit. Substance abuse, poverty, and a wide range of problems have afflicted the region for years, since most industries in the area have faded, like coal mining or timber harvesting. When these industries left the region, it also left the communities behind to fend for themselves. In a report by the Appalachian Review Commission, they found that coal industry employment fell by around 54% between 2005 and 2020. These losses were concentrated in central Appalachia. Further, the counties with the highest dependence on the coal industry tended to be rural counties in central Appalachia. Overall, many of the counties that had the greatest dependence on the coal industry suffered the greatest losses in coal production employment. Salaries also tend to be higher in coal mining counties in Appalachia versus those without coal mining jobs. Although in central Appalachia, the salaries are slightly lower than in other coal mining counties. All of this being said, rural Appalachia has been squeezed dry by their economy's biggest driver, coal mining. To this day, coal mining is still a very dangerous job to have. It's no surprise then that Purdue Pharma largely targeted those working class people who had suffered injuries from mining that had left them in chronic pain and unable to work. As the coal mining industry has diminished a bit over the past 2 decades, some people in Appalachia, which has higher poverty rates on average than the rest of the country, have been left to fend for themselves. Books like Hillbilly Elegy place the solutions to these problems that the population faces square on their shoulders. Work a little harder and get a can-do attitude, and maybe we can fix the centuries-long problem of classism in our rural communities. By the end of the book, I realized that Vance had barely even answered the question that he proposed in the beginning. Why did these people vote for Trump? In multiple interviews since Elegy was published, Vance made the claim that they like Trump because he's crass and not like the others.
I'm not like the other girls.
Not only is this not true because Donald Trump is one of the most pro-establishment politicians I have ever seen, but it's also grossly stereotyping. Apparently, if you're a politician with no filter, then the poor rural whites will love you, because we all know how vulgar they are. While plenty of people, me included, fit this stereotype, again, it is not definitive of every person in Appalachia. However, it certainly is a big factor for people's choice to vote for Trump. If people feel like they can't say certain things due to PC culture, then they will probably see Trump as an ally to their culture war. But as we already discussed, these communities tend to have worse education systems, both inside and outside of actual schools. Even when rural communities have access to good civil education, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement found that rural youth are less likely to feel that civic education has shaped their perception and understanding of our democratic system. This often leads to lower voter turnout rates in these rural areas, not to mention all the other issues that I presented from earlier, like transportation, isolation, and internet service. I'm not trying to suggest that all Trump supporters are stupid, because a large portion of his voter base is also educated voters. But when you have all of the issues that I presented in rural areas, then people may not have access to proper information on candidates. This leads to a hive mentality. And I'll tell you what, I can see that where I live especially. Trump signs galore, and when a Harris sign pops up, someone vandalizes it with a stamp of their penis. I hope that specifically hasn't happened yet, but the vandalization is true. Maybe low-income voters feel inclined to vote for Donald Trump because everyone in their small town has told them that Trump is great for the working class, despite signing tax cuts during his time in office that almost exclusively benefited people at the top. Not to mention SNAP, healthcare, and housing budget cuts. But no! I'm not like all those other white trash people. I work hard. Someday I'll be as rich as Elon Musk. Someday.
Spare some change, sir. Ma'am, can you spare some change, please? You selfish bitch!
JD Vance might have been a hillbilly at one point in his life, but he is one no more. A 6,500 square foot house will do that to you. It doesn't seem that he's forgotten where he's come from, however, because he's exploited it at every turn during his political career, in my opinion. Justin Kirkland writes for Esquire saying, "When it comes to stories of Appalachia, I'm still waiting for more tales that depict the pride of living in such a lush and mysterious area. I long for stories that revere the resilience to stay as much as those that highlight the courage to leave. And when we have a breadth of those stories, penned and directed by people who live there, maybe the occasional story focused on the region's most dramatic qualities won't feel so pointed. I happen to have a few of those for you. Appalachia Reckoning was written as a response to Hillbilly Elegy, as well as What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia that I quoted earlier. I also included a quote earlier from Barbara Kingsolver, who is the author of the fictional book Demon Copperhead. I also highly recommend you all check out the notorious White Trash, A 400-Year History of Class in America by Nancy Eisenberg. Finally, I'd like to recommend a book of poetry, Appalachian Elegy, written by Bell Hooks, a black woman who was a voice for those who are often overlooked in Appalachia. JD Vance certainly isn't the only villain in this story. For centuries, the poor white's plight has been co-opted by those at the top, turned into caricatures that garner anything but sympathy from audiences. At the end of the day, we shouldn't dislike JD for how he chooses to identify. We will never be able to verify what he said about his life. We can only take his word for it. Instead, we should dislike him for being a right-wing pundit who takes his vegetarian wife to butcher shops. Well, that's it for me, and that's it for this video. What makes videos like these great isn't me, although that is a major aspect of it. It's you. Please comment down below anything you want to comment down below. I would absolutely love to hear all of your different perspectives. If you read Hillbilly Elegy or any of the other books I mentioned, please let me know your opinions down below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you like me, you can subscribe. I post videos on this channel once a week about anything that I feel like talking about. So if that sounds like your thing, make sure to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you know when I post a video. With all that being said, before the video ends, I really want to give a special shout out to my Patreon members who are part of the Alpha and Delta tiers. If you join my Alpha or Delta tiers, you will get a special shout out by me at the end of all my videos. So thank you to Ben, Cap the Time Lord, and Olivia Schutt. I really, really appreciate all of your continued support, and thank you to all my Patreon members. I have other tiers of a lower pricing available for all of you if you are so interested in it, so my Patreon will be linked down below. I've been doing a lot of fun, exclusive content on there, so again, if you're interested in any of that, check it out down below. Anyway, I really hope you all enjoyed this video, but more importantly than that, I really hope I see you in the next video. You'll be there, right? Okay, bye.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate